jump back into the world of Android-based handhelds, and this time around, AYN returns with a sequel to their beloved Odin 2 lineup of handhelds, with the Odin 3, and powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset, which is definitely no stranger to the channel. I'm very excited to explore this chipset in a dedicated handheld device, and this one's going to be a very in-depth deep dive into the Odin 3, so I recommend diving into your snack drawer because we have a lot to cover here. And so, I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore everything that the Odin 3 has to offer and find out if this is truly an elite handheld. As always, let's start this off with a quick spec rundown, pricing, and tour of the new Odin 3, which, if you're familiar with AYN, comes in the cardboard box that in some ways is just as iconic on its own as the actual devices themselves, with the Made in China plastered across the side, but inside, of course, we've got the Odin 3 with its familiar but also new packaging that immediately lets you know right at the top of the package that this is in fact something different. And so let's find out what actually is different here with the Odin 3 by going inside the box, and it all starts with the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset that powers the Odin 3, which is the first time we've seen this in an Odin handheld and does represent a fairly significant jump in power coming from the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. The 8 Elite is an old friend here on the channel as I've been covering it in various ways over the past year, but it did represent an important jump for Qualcomm at the time, which introduced their custom Orion CPU architecture and features 8 cores with clock speeds up to 4.32 GHz, and the Adreno 830 GPU for graphics. We will definitely talk more about what this means for the Odin 3 in some upcoming sections. Now, coming from the Odin 2, we do have the return of a 6-inch display, but that's about where these similarities end, as the Odin 3 is using the same 6-inch 16:9 AMOLED display found in the Thor, which supports a 120Hz refresh rate at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with up to 650 nits of peak brightness. The display for many will be a highlight here, and rightfully so, as the AMOLED display is a step up from the IPS panel found on the original Odin 2 and puts it more in line with the Odin 2 Portal. The colors, viewing angles, brightness are all really great here, and games just look beautiful with this display. And for those that are looking to purchase the black model, that AMOLED panel will really blend in well with the glass front when utilizing different aspect ratios. And as is the norm for AYN, we do have multiple configurations available for the Odin 3, which starts at a base model that features 8GB of LPDDR5X RAM and only 128GB of UFS 3.1 storage, which is unique to this base model. Since the Pro, Max, and Ultra configurations all use the faster UFS 4.0 storage, starting at 12GB and 256GB for the Pro, 16GB and 512GB for the Max, which is the model I have on hand here, and finally the 24GB and 1TB Ultra configuration. And these come in 5 different colors, including black, white, rainbow, which is the color I have on hand, clear blue, and clear purple. The base model only comes in black. We've also got expandable storage with the micro SD slot. On board we have Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 6, a USB-C 3.1 port for data, charging, and video out up to 4K 60, as well as a 3.5mm audio port and a fingerprint sensor. And finally, out of the box we have Android 15. For the Odin 3, we do have the same 8000 mAh battery capacity as the Odin 2, with support for 60-watt charging, and we will look at all of this in depth later on in the battery section. Now inside the box we do have a fold-out card with the specs of the Odin 3 as well as a USB-C to C cable. The Odin 3 is available for ordering directly from the AYN website, and they are taking pre-orders for their Batch 3 shipment, which as of right now is slated to begin shipping in the middle of January, and includes a free TPU protective shell. The prices start at $329 for the base model, $399 for the Pro, $449 for the Max, and finally $519 for the Ultra. I'd like to thank AYN for sending this unit ahead of time so that I can provide my viewers with this in-depth coverage, and as I always require, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. So let's take a tour around the Odin 3 and focus in on the controls, starting at the top right where we have the return of the stacked shoulder button and trigger as seen in prior Odin devices. The shoulder button finds itself in a place between the size of the ones found on the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Portal, which makes sense that it's smaller than the Odin 2 Portals But I am glad that AYN went back and made both the button and trigger slightly larger than what we saw on the Odin 2. The shoulder button has a subtle clickiness to it that is slightly quieter than the one found on the Odin 2, but does use a similar dome switch which isn't very loud overall. The shoulder trigger is a very nice improvement coming from the Odin 2, which felt cheap in comparison to the Odin 3s, as well as being much louder than the ones on the Odin 3. The triggers are awesome on the Odin 3, and they are very quiet and have just the right amount of resistance and travel. I really do like the way these feel. Across the top, we have the power button with the integrated fingerprint sensor, the volume up and down buttons, and then of course the left shoulder button and trigger. Now coming down the side, we can see the curves of the Odin 3, which give you a nice grip on the handheld and really help with its comfort. At the bottom, we have the micro SD slot, a 3.5mm headset port, and the USB-C for charging data and video out. On the back, we have the large intake vent, as well as 2 exhaust vents for the active cooling that's built into the Odin 3, and we will be taking all of this apart shortly so that we can peek under the hood. We also have 2 rear programmable buttons, as well as some nice texturing for the grips, which again help with the comfort. There's very minimal branding here with just the AYN logo that is at the bottom. So let's now talk about the controls at the front, and another improvement that AYN has made here with the Odin 3 are the inclusion of these improved analog sticks that have excellent range and movement, especially when compared to the original Odin 2. In fact, these are improvements over the ones found in the Portal as well, and we will compare the 2 sticks in that teardown section. Below the left side analog stick, we have the usual AYN D-pad that makes a return here and feels as good as it always has. I don't really have much to say about this, and for those familiar with prior AYN or even Retroid devices, the one on the Odin 3 is very similar in the way it moves and functions, with a satisfying pivot and movement from left to right and top to bottom. I really enjoy using this D-pad quite a bit. Now on the opposite side, above the right analog stick, we have the face buttons that are set up in the Nintendo BA-YX configuration. And I'm impressed by how quiet these are, and they are definitely less noisy and clacky compared to the Odin 2 Portal, for example. I like that they are a bit flatter at the top compared to the Odin 2, which makes them a bit easier to press down on, and overall these have a good amount of travel with good response and feedback. These face buttons remind me of some that we've seen before, and I will confirm that during the teardown portion. And finally, on the front we do have the start, select, and then dedicated home and back buttons, as well as front-firing stereo speakers, and these definitely pack quite the punch. I'm very impressed by how loud they get at the highest setting. There is a bit of distortion when it's at that max setting, and I do wish we had a bit better scaling with the volume, since going from 50% to 100% is quite the jump, and then going under 50%, it starts to quickly get very quiet. So before we move on to tearing all this apart, let's talk about the build quality and comfort, and this is definitely a very solid device and feels very good in the hands. I find that it's very comfortable to hold just as is, and even compared to the Odin 2, which was pretty comfortable as well, it's an improvement because AYN finally offset the D-pad and analog stick, and the way you grip the Odin 3 makes reaching for that D-pad and analog stick at the bottom feel a bit more natural. Now, if you have bigger hands, AYN is currently including a freebie TPU shell during the pre-order period, which does make those grips a little bit bigger, but for me personally, I've honestly just been using the device without anything on it, and it really hasn't been much of an issue for me. Now, the offset D-pad and analog stick is just one of many subtle improvements that I appreciate, and does make this feel nicer overall than the Odin 2, and just the small touches to the shoulder triggers, grips, face buttons, analog sticks, and yes, even the glass front, whether you hate it or not, make this feel like a much more refined handheld compared to its predecessor. It truly is the perfect marriage of the Odin 2 and Odin 2 Portal design language. It's almost like a Portal Mini in some ways. Now we will find out very soon in the teardown just why part of the build quality is substantial, as it does translate to what's going on under the hood, and probably the only real standout issue, because it's so loud, is the loud fan that either goes from quiet to full blast with no real range in between, since even in the smart fan mode, the fan basically goes from quiet to takeoff with not much of a real range in between. My fan does exhibit a whine that can be noticeable at full blast, and it's seemingly intermittent on my device, but regardless, the fan is loud, and I unfortunately don't think much can be done in that department, as this is a limitation of the size constraints, but hopefully AYN can source slightly better fans that don't exhibit the whine as much. And just as a comparison, I have my Thor here, which is also very loud and noisy as well at that top end. I've reached out to AYN and suggested some better adjustments on the fan curve, since we will explore in the benchmark section that the quiet fan preset does a solid job for the most part. but it could benefit from just a little bit more airflow, and maybe we can avoid having to really ramp up that fan at full blast. So it's now time to take this all apart and check out what's going on under the hood of the Odin 3. And this will let us examine a few things, including how accessible the battery is for servicing, compare the analog sticks in the Odin 3 to prior devices, and look at some other stuff like the face buttons and maybe even go a step beyond. Feel free to make use of my timestamps to skip ahead to whatever section you might be curious about in case teardowns aren't your thing. So my Odin 3 is all powered down and ready to go for this teardown, and on the back we have 4 visible screws so that we can get the back cover off. I'll go ahead and use a Phillips head size 00 bit, which does seem to work well to remove the screws here. Bada bing bada boom, screws removed, and now it's time to separate the back cover from the rest of the device. I'll go ahead and use a pick to gently get in between, and what I'll do here is go in from the top. And if I apply just a little pressure by pulling back on that bump out for the shoulder trigger, I can force a little separation by hand to get my pick in there, and then gently run the pick across the device to get the other tabs separated from the shell. This actually separated pretty easily, and I think I'll just go ahead and now try to separate the rest of the back cover by hand. And so by putting a little force on the same side where the shoulder trigger is, I'm able to get most of it separated, and the same goes for the opposite side. Don't be afraid to put a little force on it since it's pretty forgiving and there are actually no cables connected to this back cover, so pry away. When I popped that back cover off, a little rubber piece came flying off, so just be mindful of that, and it's actually a small rubber piece for those rear programmable buttons, so just make sure those are still intact when you are separating. And this is a good opportunity to take a look at this back cover piece, and we can see that we have the mesh screen in place for the exhaust to keep dust and debris out of those grills, and then of course the massive intake vent, and then the mechanism for the rear programmable buttons. The piece is pretty flexible, but that isn't honestly too surprising here. So let's now take a look at the exposed back of the Odin 3, and we do have a few things visible here, but there are also a lot of things hidden away under these pieces of plastic. I will say that this is so nicely organized and very clean looking on the inside, which I always appreciate. The most visible thing here is the 8000 mAh battery, which unfortunately does seem to have its connector buried under the fan here, and something that we have seen before, so it's not unusual for AYN, but I suspect that once that fan assembly is removed, we should be able to access the connector. And it looks like the black pieces here at the corners should house the front firing speakers. Okay, so the first task here is to get to the new analog stick and those face buttons and check out how they look and maybe even find out if they can be swapped with some other devices. The best part about being able to review my footage after the fact is that I can edit it in a way that guides you, the viewer, in the correct order. So in this case, we actually need to remove this piece that's at the bottom center of the Odin 3 in order to gain access to the speaker connection. This piece is held into place with just 2 screws, and we can continue to use the same Phillips head size 00 bit for these 2 screws as well as every other screw inside the Odin 3. With those 2 screws removed, let's keep this piece off to the side as we can fully disconnect it, but we can gain access to the speaker connection and disconnect that cable so we can focus back on removing that board on the left side to gain access to the analog stick and face buttons. There are 4 screws that hold the speaker assembly in place, which is the black piece here on the left side. I've already done that here, but this is where you will want to remove those screws, and then you can lift the speakers out of the shell and disconnect the speaker cable. With it disconnected, we can take a look at the speaker, and this is such an unusual looking speaker. I don't think I've ever seen one quite like this in a handheld before, and it partly might explain why the audio is pretty good here with the Odin 3. Okay, so we are now ready to remove this piece of plastic that matches the color of the device. There are 6 screws here that need to be removed. 2 of them are hiding beside the shoulder trigger, and your screwdriver should be able to fit in here without touching the trigger at all. As a tip, if you press the shoulder trigger down, you can actually remove the screw without it attaching itself to the magnets that are part of these Hall effect triggers. And thanks to the power of editing, we now have all 6 screws removed, and this is a fairly large piece that comes out, which does more than just look pretty on the inside of the handheld. It is actually the housing for the trigger and part of the rear programmable button, so it does serve a few purposes. So with that piece out of the way, we can now see the daughter board for the face buttons as well as the analog stick that is directly accessible without needing to remove the daughter board. The analog stick is held into place with 2 screws, so make sure to disconnect the cable by gently lifting up the black tab, which will allow the cable to easily slide out. Also, don't forget to go on the opposite side and remove the analog stick cap so that we can take the analog stick assembly out with no trouble. And I can immediately tell that these are different than what we've seen in prior Odin handhelds, with the assembly being quite larger than the Jinful ones used in the Odin 2, Odin 2 Mini, and even the Odin 2 Portal. And what do you know, I've actually got a disassembled Odin 2 Portal ready to go here, for science of course, and Here are the Jinful sticks used in the Odin 2 portal compared to the ones here with the Odin 3. And it does look like the Odin 3 is still using Jinful branded sticks, but definitely larger, which explains the improved movement and range that we get with the Odin 3. These will obviously not be interchangeable with anything on any of the Odin 2 models, and it's kind of hilarious to see these side by side. And I will say that I'm very happy that AYN decided to keep pushing forward and going with these larger sticks on the Odin 3. Okay, so back to the Odin 3, and it's now time to remove the daughter board so we can gain access to the face buttons. We have 4 additional screws that we need to remove here, and we also have 2 separate cables that need to be disconnected. One for the shoulder button at the top, and then the motherboard cable on the right next to the battery. Both of these can be disconnected by gently lifting the tab, and we will actually slide the cable out once we've removed all the screws. And just like that, the board will come out of place, and in my case, I pulled out the white piece of plastic that diffuses the RGB lighting, which can be removed and put back into place, so no worries there. And finally, the moment of truth. We have reached the membrane and face button, so let's go ahead and take this out of the shell, and what do you know, this looks very familiar. In fact, I've seen a very similar setup with the glued down face buttons over on some Retroid devices. I think we know what's going to happen next, and yes, I had to go and grab a Retroid device and disassemble my Retroid Pocket G2 and find out if in fact these are the same face buttons and membrane. And as always, I have one all ready to go here, and what do you know, these are very similar. Now, looking at the two in my hand, at first glance they don't appear to be the same. And that's because the membrane is turned in a different direction, and the buttons are keyed differently. The thing is that if you were to separate the buttons from the membrane and then rotate that membrane, they are identical. And the cool thing about the face buttons is that you can do some clipping to make it work in the Odin 3. Which means that in theory you could buy parts from Retroid to use here on the Odin 3. And for those that know me well, I went ahead and did just that and adjusted my G2 face buttons to work on the Odin 3. Now here's a close-up of the two side by side with their original setup, and so on the G2 buttons, I needed to clip off 2 pieces of the B button, all of the A, 2 from the X, and finally 2 from the Y, and I've circled them on screen here, so in theory if you want to do something similar, just screen cap this and then copy it. So with the clip buttons, I was able to place them into the Odin 3 and then use that same membrane from the Retroid Pocket G2, and it worked great, and I actually really like this color combination. I think it's pretty slick. Okay, so let's now shift our focus on the battery and the process to get access to that in the event that you need to service it. Basically, if you remove the back cover and had the device as seen here, you would start working on this piece right here. Okay, so back to the way my Odin 3 looks now with all the other stuff removed. The piece we are working on here is the same plastic color as the Odin 3 shell, and this piece is held into place with 3 screws that need to be removed. There are also 2 cables that need to be disconnected here, which are taped down partly. So let's go ahead and disconnect the cables by gently lifting them out. And I did this by hand with my fingers, but you can totally use a pair of tweezers to do this. And then let's get these 3 screws removed as well. Okay, so with that done, the piece comes out pretty easily and we can put it aside. With that piece removed, we can see part of the connection for the battery, which is held into place with a bracket. And as I suspected, the other part of this bracket is covered by the fan assembly. Also, don't be like me and leave your micro SD card inside the device when you're tearing it down. This is actually the first thing that you should do before any type of teardown. So we're ready now to remove the fan assembly, which is held into place by 2 screws, and just like that, the fan will come right out, and I recommend trying to remove the fan with the tape still intact, since we can reuse this for reassembly. And here's a look at the fan complete with its model number. And now we have access to the battery connection, and we can remove the 2 screws on that bracket which hold the connectors in place. There's a little A sticker there, probably for warranty purposes, and I'm pretty sure that's not enforceable, at least in the United States, so I'll just remove it since I guess I'm kind of a rebel or something. So there you have it, we now have the steps to gain access to that battery. So one last thing to explore is the D-pad, and so let's work our way over to the right side of the device. Much like on the left side, we must remove the 4 screws holding the speaker assembly in place first. Let's go ahead and do that, and I have completely put it aside because I've already disconnected it from the main board. But I will be honest that I've already done this a few times on my own, and you can actually leave the 2 cables connected to the main board and keep the speaker connected, but off to the side, and it will not impact your ability to gain access to the D-pad or analog stick here. Again, like the left side, we have 6 screws holding the trigger assembly in place, so let's quickly get these removed and this piece will come right out without any issues. Now we have the daughter board exposed, and let's first disconnect all the cables here. So again, there's one at the top for the shoulder button and one at the side for the motherboard. You can leave the analog stick assembly alone if you're just going for the D-pad here, which is what I'm doing, so leave the cable connected and the screws in place. Let's now remove the 4 screws holding the daughter board in place, and don't forget to remove the analog stick cap on the opposite side. But once the screws are out, we can take the entirety of this board with the analog stick assembly attached all in one shot. And what do you know, we have yet another glued on piece, with the D-pad seemingly looking like many other components we've seen in the past, not just from AYN, but from Retroid as well. The D-pad here is smaller than what we get on the Odin 2 Portal, so those parts will not be interchangeable. But I still have this Retroid Pocket G2 disassembled, and yes, the D-pad is identical here, and can work in the Odin 3 without any issues. And I suspect the same is true for most of the Retroid devices, as well as the original Odin 2. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot here. Now, I'm not going to include it here, but I did go beyond, and I completely tore down to the actual motherboard because I wanted to replace the thermal compound with some Thermal Grizzly Pro putty to see if we could help the Odin 3 out with the thermals. And part of the reason why I don't want to focus on this too much, as this is not how the device comes stock, so it's more of a science experiment for myself to explore some options to help the 8 Elite out, which is a much more powerful chipset than what we've seen in the past in dedicated handheld devices. And coming from the mobile world with phones and tablets equipped with the 8 Elite, you typically find that these devices are using substantial cooling, especially for those focused on gaming. And even here on the channel, I've covered devices like the Lenovo Legion Y700, the Red Magic 10 Pro and Astra, and all of these have something very similar in common, which is that they all use a vapor chamber with liquid metal for cooling, if that is any indication of what we're dealing with when it comes to thermal management. And so I do think that there should be some consideration there in a dedicated handheld going beyond just a typical heatsink and air cooling for these handhelds, which is the perfect segue into our benchmarks. And I'm going to run through this very quickly. And first off, let's compare the performance presets that come with the Odin 3, which is standard, performance, and high performance, and running it through the usual Geekbench 6, 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme, and Antutu benchmark. There is a common theme here across the board for all 3 of these tests. And you might have noticed that all of these numbers are very close to each other regardless of the preset, which tells me that it doesn't really matter which setting you use. And the only real difference currently is that you have access to different options for the fan. But again, it's basically off, quiet, and loud. I've also let AYN know about the similarities for performance presets, and I would love to see a bit more separation between the presets, which would make a little more sense. Now, if you're coming from a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 device like the Odin 2, Odin 2 Mini, or Portal, what kind of jump in performance are we looking at here going to the Snapdragon 8 Elite? And for Geekbench 6, taking the numbers of the high performance preset from the Odin 3, just to keep things all even, we see about a 38% increase for the multi-core score, with about a 54% increase for that single core score, so we are definitely seeing an appreciable jump on the CPU side. Moving on to the Wildlife Extreme test, and here we see a fairly large jump of about 61% on the GPU side. And finally, with Antutu as kind of an overall benchmark, we see nearly a 70% jump in the overall score. And so I think it goes without saying that the 8 Elite is a significant jump in power from the 8 Gen 2. And finally, for fun, I ran an actual in-game benchmark, since we're kinda at that point now with these handhelds, and using the PC version of Tomb Raider 2013, at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with high settings, and we can see that in-game much of the same increases are evident here, with the Odin 3 managing over 60 frames per second as an average, and about a 51% improvement over the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. So now let's shift gears and talk about the thermals, using the Wildlife Extreme stress test and looking at the various profiles and combinations. We can see that the fan is definitely doing something here. Since I did test in the standard mode without the fan on, which can only be done in the standard setting, and we had just a 66.6% stability, but even just using the standard preset with the quiet fan, and we were able to get up to an 83.7% stability. The same thing happens when we ramp up the fan to use the sport fan option, which is only available in the performance or high performance setting, and going from the quiet to the sport, the stability percentage improves again. Now, I'd love to be able to have either a setting or at least be able to manually adjust the fan to end up somewhere in the middle, which would be nice for the absolute high end, so really things like Gamehub. Since honestly, I've found that the quiet fan setting works well for things like PS2, Gamecube, Wii, and even Switch. Now, if you remember from the teardown section, I mentioned that I went ahead and used some Thermal Grizzly Pro Putty, and I definitely saw improvements there. So for example, on the standard preset with the quiet fan setting, I saw nearly a 10% jump in the stability percentage, which is pretty substantial. Again, I think as we move towards chasing high-end gaming like PC gaming with Gamehub, and with chipsets like the 8 Elite able to draw more power, thermal management will be very important for any company moving forward. I will say in the case of the Odin 3, it's not a complete deal breaker when those temperatures get very high on either the CPU or GPU side, since the Odin 3 itself doesn't really get hot, at least at the areas where your hands will be. So on the grips and on the controls on the front, you don't really feel any of the heat, and the fan definitely pushes the heat out and away from the device as expected. And again, with the higher power draw of the 8 Elite chipset, we are starting to get into what we usually see over in the x86 space. Okay, so enough of numbers, let's actually dive into some gaming and look at real-world examples of how the 8 Elite performs. And we'll first look at native Android games, and if you've been following me for some time, or at least have seen some of my videos in the past, covering devices with the 8 Elite chipset, you will know that basically the 8 Elite will handle just about everything that is available on the Google Play Store. Now, I still wanted to cover this for anyone that is new to the capabilities of the Snapdragon 8 Elite, but I definitely recommend checking out some of my other videos with the Lenovo Legion Y700, Red Magic Astra, and Red Magic 10 Pro for some more examples of Android experiences and how they run. So let's try to keep this section condensed, which will allow us to spend more time on things like emulation and PC gaming, and the reality is that there's just not much on the Play Store that will make the Odin 3 work hard. And of course, popular games like Genshin Impact and Wuthering Waves will both run at their max settings with a steady 60 frames per second. The same goes for newer experiences like Destiny Rising, which is an awesome mobile take on the Destiny franchise, and this is a game that runs at ultra settings at 60 frames per second using the standard performance preset and quiet fan setting, which doesn't really seem to make the 8 Elite work too hard, and thermals for a lot of the Android games also seem to be very good here. I will say that all of my testing was done before I switched over to the Thermal Grizzly Pro Putty, since this is meant to be a showcase and test of the device as it was sent to me. Bright Memory Infinite is an awesome first-person shooter that a lot of my regular viewers know by now that I enjoy occasionally showcasing, which is a pretty cool premium experience from the Google Play Store and has awesome visuals and best of all the ability to cap frame rate to 120 frames per second, making full use of the Odin 3's 120Hz display. And for this game I am set to 1080p with all the fancy stuff turned on, and again just using the standard performance with the quiet fan option, and the results here are excellent as well. Finally, I've got another awesome premium experience here with Grid Legends, which did receive a full port to Android earlier this year, and this is the full-blown PC game experience on Android. Unfortunately, the developer has this game capped at 30 frames per second, but there are ways to get around that by editing some files. But as is, out of the box, this game runs very well with the Odin 3, using the graphics preset, and you can see that it's barely making the device sweat. And one last thing of note, there is a documented issue currently with Fortnite, which I've let AYN know about, and some awesome developers like Productivity might even have a solution for this issue, so I'm pretty confident that this will be addressed and fixed in the future. I will say that Fortnite runs very well with the 8 Elite chipset, and I'm pretty sure I have gameplay footage of that in some of my other videos with 8 Elite devices. So with Android gaming out of the way, let's dive into the world of emulation, and there's a lot to cover here. And let's start out with some of the lighter platforms. And first things first, let's talk about Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, and Game Boy Advance specifically when using RetroArch. Now, RetroArch out of the box is configured to use OpenGL, and you will find that some of these emulators don't particularly play nice with this chipset using that backend. But it's a simple fix of switching over to the Vulkan backend, and this will resolve at least the issue specifically with Nintendo 64 regardless of the core you use, and the same goes for PlayStation 1 using Swan Station or even Game Boy Advance using MGBA. One of the biggest benefits of enjoying platforms like this on a device like the Odin 3 is that we are barely tapping into the power of the 8 Elite, which really helps with battery efficiency, and we will see this later on in the battery section, just what this might mean for lighter platforms. The same goes for 6th generation consoles like the PlayStation 2 using Nether SX2, since the 8 Elite has enough power on hand to brute force a lot of the more problematic games, and for many games we can go well beyond the 2.5 times native PlayStation 2 resolution for 1080p, which on a device like the Odin 3 is definitely overkill, but something like God of War 2 for example will not have any issues running that 1080p resolution, and the same goes for other games like Dirge of Cerberus, which to this day is still a game that requires a few tweaks to get it running properly, but does run very well here with the 8 Elite. The reality is that the biggest limitation is the software itself, and that is true for many emulators on the Android platform as we get into the higher end stuff. Now, in the world of Nintendo, using the Dolphin emulator for both Gamecube and Wii, we can basically max out the upscaling available to us for a large portion of the library, which again is probably not necessary since we only have a 1080p panel here with the Odin 3. But some of the usuals like F-Zero GX for Gamecube is running at a max resolution upscale of 6 times the native Gamecube resolution, and the same goes for games like Super Mario Galaxy 2 for the Wii, which looks gorgeous using this maxed out upscaling. I will say that there might be some games that have graphical issues with Wii for Dolphin, and this will require a change in the settings under graphics settings, changing the shader compilation mode from the default of specialized to exclusive Uber shaders, which will address it, and thankfully we have a very powerful GPU that can handle this specific setting. Let's continue on with Wii U using Cemu for Android, which is another platform that will run quite well with the Snapdragon 8 Elite. But Cemu for Android is still very much a work in progress, and so a lot of games just won't work or won't work well, which is an issue with the emulator itself. And as I said before, the biggest challenge for a lot of these higher end emulators is that most of them are a work in progress, with development moving at a slower pace for something like Cemu on Android. For those that are longtime viewers of the channel, you know that one of my favorite things to do with Cemu on Android is to make use of the graphic packs for games, and Fast Racing Neo is a game that in particular is interesting because we can adjust the frame limit on it and utilize the 120Hz panel that we get here with the Odin 3. Fast Racing Neo is one of the few games that we can do this with on Wii U, but it's pretty amazing to run at 120 frames per second using the Wii U's default resolution of 720p. And of course, let's talk about the big one, which is Switch emulation, and I've been covering this on the channel since the 8 Elite first dropped more than a year ago. And unfortunately, more than a year later, we still don't have custom drivers for the 8 Elite. But that isn't necessarily as bad as it might sound, since Qualcomm drivers have actually come a long way, and the same can be said for the various Switch emulators including Citron, Eden, Kenji NX, and all of the forks in between. Switch emulation is very interesting here because the 8 Elite seems to not break much of a sweat when it comes to running the games that work well with the chipset. And I have seen tremendous progress made on the software side that has allowed more games than ever to work now and with far less graphical issues. Darksiders 2 is a game that I absolutely love to load up, and this was a game that in the past, out of the box, had obvious graphical issues that required tweaking. But now the game just works without any of those graphical issues using the Eden emulator. Super Mario Odyssey is another game that is a good example of this, since this game also would require specific tweaks that were immediately obvious from the beginning of the game, where effects like the heavy fog would not render properly. And this now has been improved, and the game exhibits far less graphical issues than before, with performance that is just beyond excellent. I've been using Mario Odyssey more recently as a battery benchmark, and we will see in a bit what that means here for the Odin 3. Mario Odyssey still does have that issue when using scaling beyond the native resolution. So for example, if you go to a 2x native resolution, the game doesn't go full screen, and this is an issue with a few Nintendo games that I've experienced here and in the past. The positive is that native resolution using the dock mode is the equivalent of 1080p, and so we are nicely matched to the resolution of the panel here with the Odin 3. I did test quite a number of games here with the Odin 3, and again, just a few other favorites of mine like Super Mario 3D World, but specifically Bowser's Fury runs very well here with the 8 Elite at that native resolution with docked mode, which looks gorgeous here on the Odin 3. Now, a game that didn't work in the past using Eden with the 8 Elite was Red Dead Redemption, which now does work using this emulator, and again, another positive sign of progress being made with Eden in general. Switch emulation on Android for me to this day is still very much a bonus platform in the sense that Switch emulation on Android is still a work in progress that has seen its hurdles, and specifically with the 8 Elite, we do have examples of games that have issues with compatibility and graphical issues that might require you to jump around between the various forks or make some specific tweaks and just experimentation in general. As always, the best way to play Switch games is on a Switch or Switch 2. Now, in terms of emulation, I think that if your sole use case for the Odin 3 is Switch emulation, you might want to see how things progress, or perhaps find out if there are issues with a specific game that you might want to play. The reality is that there are several thousand games on Switch, and so there will be a lot of games that work great here. So let's switch on over to the Sony side and talk about PlayStation 3 emulation, which is definitely a bonus platform for any device on Android. And that's not because of the lack of power, but more the lack of maturity for the emulators available, with both APS-3E and RPCSX very much early in development and works in progress. Now I won't spend much time here for the sake of time since this video is already longer than I want it to be, but I have a very in-depth showcase covering PlayStation 3 emulation with RPCSX using the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset right here on the channel, and I will have it linked on screen and in my description. I think the video is useful for those seriously considering PlayStation 3 emulation, and a lot of the lighter games will work quite well, so think games that were typically PlayStation Network exclusives like Resogun here, which I have running at a 150% upscale for 1080p, and the Snapdragon 8 Elite doesn't really sweat much here, and this is the type of game that can easily go with 200 or even 250% upscaling without much trouble. My showcase focuses on much heavier titles, and I will answer it right here, right now. But God of War 3, well, you can forget about it. Now I have managed to get the God of War 3 E3 demo running, but again, the power isn't the issue, it's the emulator itself, and so temper your expectations with PlayStation 3 emulation on Android in general, but refer to my showcase as an example of what we can enjoy, and much like Switch, there are thousands of games on PlayStation 3 and quite a good number of them will work. For what it's worth, Switch emulation is definitely in a far better state, so you will be much more successful over there. Finally, let's talk about PC gaming on the Odin 3, which can be done in various ways, including Winlator, Gamehub and Gamehub Lite, and Game Native. For this section, I will be exclusively using the standard build of Gamehub, and I think that for many considering an Odin 3, this is probably what they are most interested in when it comes to exploring the capabilities of a high-end chipset like the Snapdragon 8 Elite, and what potential it brings to the table for PC gaming on Android. This is another topic that I've been following pretty closely since last year with the 8 Elite, and we went from a world that didn't have Gamehub available just yet, and Winlator not working at all with an 8 Elite device, to now having various options that run games quite well, which definitely shows you just how much can change in just a little over a year. I definitely spent a lot of time here testing various games, builds, and all that good stuff, and in terms of gameplay footage, I probably have the most here to share in this specific section, since I really am very excited about where we are with PC gaming on Android, and the amount of progress that has been made and just what we're capable of running here is nothing short of amazing. I will say that just like Switch emulation, I consider this a bonus platform, because I'd rather temper your expectations, since while a good number of games work well, Gamehub and the like represent the cutting edge, which means that things are very much still a work in progress. And in terms of this segment, we are seeing changes happen on a nearly a daily basis, which is both exciting, but can be overwhelming if you're not wanting to tinker around with settings. Now that is not to say that no game will just run out of the box. On Gamehub, which actually does a pretty decent job getting you up and running, the reality is that you will get the most out of Gamehub and similar by getting your hands a little dirty and experimenting with the options. You've probably seen on screen the range of games that are playable with Gamehub, going from older games that I absolutely love and have been showing here on the channel for a while, with Blur, which is basically maxed out in settings at 1080p resolution, hitting 60 frames per second. And coming to very new releases like Luminous Arise, which is a game I'm currently addicted to and I thought would be a beautiful game to show off with the AMOLED display. And Luminous Arise is running here at 1080p using low settings, which lets us hit that 60 frames per second target. With the ability to play PC games on Android, we can also rely less on Switch versions, and so now we have more ways to potentially play the same game. For example, Ori and the Blind Forest is a game that works pretty much without issue here using Gamehub at 1080p, and pretty much hits that 60 frames per second target. And a few other games that I've shown here on screen like The Crew 2, which is a racing game that I'm actually finding myself enjoying more recently thanks to the addition of the offline mode, and we can run The Crew 2 here at either 720p using medium settings, or go with a 1080p resolution but with low settings, and we can actually hit above 30 frames per second for both games. But this is the case for many games where we have some room to tweak the graphical settings to either favor performance or graphical fidelity. Stray is a great example of a game that has had its graphical issues fixed with the latest 8 Elite Gen 5 drivers that we have available now in Gamehub. And this is a pretty tough game to run that does fairly well at 720p using low settings. Finally, a carryover from my coverage of prior 8 Elite devices, but I've found that many love seeing Grand Theft Auto 5 running here with Gamehub. And it definitely serves as this kind of benchmark game here, which I do have running at 1080p, using normal settings with a 60 frames per second cap to keep things nice and steady, but this game does go above 60 frames per second quite frequently. Now, thinking about the sheer number of games available on the PC platform and Steam, and the reality is that there will be a lot of games that will be playable, and so I think this is a very exciting area for anyone that loves experimenting or tinkering, especially when it comes to pushing the possibilities of hardware and software. There's a lot of fun to be had here with the Odin 3. I could easily spend an entire video about this topic, and so unfortunately I think I've already gone on far too long here. And so let's quickly cover one more area that I find great for devices like the Odin 3, which is game streaming, especially from a local PC using something like Artemis and Apollo, which the combination of the two result in easily the best experience you can have doing streaming from your PC. The Snapdragon 8 Elite with the combination of the ultra low latency option in Artemis gives us average decoding times that are sub 1 millisecond, which is absolutely amazing for local game streaming. And this allows us to enjoy games like Hades 2 streaming from your local PC at 120 frames per second and at a 1080p resolution with these decode times. And so long as your PC is capable of it, you can enjoy 120Hz and 1080p gaming with the combination of Artemis and Apollo. And of course, after all this gaming, how does the Odin 3 fare when it comes to battery life? And this time around I ran a few different tests to give a nice range of what we can potentially expect here. And as usual, let's start out with the lightest test using Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo, with the Odin 3 set to use the standard performance preset and no fan, with 50% brightness and volume with both the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned off, battery saver turned on, and the RGB lights turned off. And yes, you are reading those numbers right, since we hit almost 27.5 hours of on-screen time, which is now the new record for the channel, dethroning the Red Magic 11 Pro, which was the most recent champion from just last month. Now look, I knew the results would be good, but this is absolutely mad. And if you find yourself on a deserted island, you probably want this handheld with you. Okay, so let's take things up a notch, and Kratos makes a return to diving endlessly for my battery testing with God of War 2 for the PlayStation 2. And here I have God of War 2 set to use 3 times the native PlayStation 2 resolution with the standard performance preset, but this time we have the quiet fan option turned on, 50% brightness and volume, with the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and RGB lights all turned off, and we came in at around 7 hours and 15 minutes. Which really showcases just how much we can get out of the 8 Elite even at this level of emulation. But most importantly, we have room to get more battery life here if you just stick to 1080p upscaling or even take it down further. Another very important thing to note here is that the temperatures remained very solid with just the standard preset and quiet fan setting, and the Odin 3 did not experience any type of thermal throttling for the entirety of this test. Now, I mentioned earlier that I ran a battery test with Super Mario Odyssey, and this is one that I've been using more recently as a way to highlight how efficient the 8 Elite chipsets can be with Switch emulation specifically, and with Super Mario Odyssey using Eden at the native resolution in docked mode with the same standard performance preset, the quiet fan option on, at a 50% brightness and volume, with the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and RGB all kept off, and we came in with a little more than 6 hours of on-screen time. And again, thermals remained solid with no issues in terms of throttling, and I just love seeing devices like this get such solid battery life with Switch emulation, and it's very exciting to see. Finally, I have one more battery test, and I don't think I've ever done one with this game, but now we are entering a world where this is going to become the norm moving forward, and an important way to benchmark battery life when it comes to PC gaming on Android. And so here I have Tomb Raider 2013 using Gamehub at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with low settings set to a 120 frames per second cap, using the same standard performance preset and quiet fan setting with the same 50% brightness and volume, Wi-Fi turned on, Bluetooth off, and the RGB lights on. And I guess this would be a kind of worst case scenario test, but I gotta say that this is still pretty impressive, and with this setup we came in at a little over 2 hours and 45 minutes. And again, we can totally scale back some settings to potentially get more battery life, but honestly, I'm a simple guy, and seeing a PC game like Tomb Raider running on an Android device, with a translation layer hitting 120 frames per second, and getting similar battery life to an actual x86 handheld, puts a smile on my face. Now, this battery test was also useful to check sustained thermals in Gamehub, which is definitely a concern for me. And in this test with Tomb Raider, which ran for nearly 3 hours, you can see that it was very heavy on the GPU side, bringing the temperature up to almost 90 degrees Celsius. And the battery reported a temperature as high as 52 degrees Celsius by the time the test ended, which in particular concerns me more and is definitely on the higher side. Now, for what it's worth, the Odin 3 still maintained performance and ran this game at its target of 120 frames per second for the entirety of the test. Again, I talked more about some of this back in the thermal section earlier, but this is just another thing to make note of here. And in terms of charging, the Odin 3 is currently only supporting up to 27 watt charging speeds, despite the fact that AYN lists it as supporting 60 watts on their website. And I did contact AYN about this, but I haven't heard back from them just yet, and so at least based on that 27 watt charging speed, after 30 minutes the Odin 3 reached about 34%, with a full charge from 0% to 100% taking a little over 2 hours, which is where that faster charging will be really nice to have. And that about does it for this in-depth look at the Odin 3, and I really appreciate if you managed to stay along for the entire ride here. And I think it goes without saying that the Odin 3 and the 8 Elite is a very powerful combination that can really push some of the limits of what's possible here on Android. I think for many, if you're coming from something like an Odin 2 device, you might not feel as compelled to upgrade if you're content with what your device already does. But if you really want to experiment with the cutting edge and high end, for example PC gaming on Android, the Odin 3 becomes a consideration for that pursuit. There is a lot of power on hand here, and there are a lot of nice refinements to the design coming from the original Odin 2, like the AMOLED display, improved controls, and better battery efficiency that might make it worthwhile for those looking to upgrade. At the end of the day, I'm just as excited to continue exploring the potential of the 8 Elite, and there's no doubt I will be exploring it further here for the channel. As always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.